Happy to be with all of you again. I can't see how you all look, but trusting that you're all well. We're going back now to documents that we were looking at last week. And this is the 9th of the documents that are available for downloading. It has to do with a brief history of the faith as outlined in the message of Shoghi Effendi to the United Nations Committee on the Future of the Holy Land. Again, we have this masterful reduction of so much information. Shoghi Effendi has processed it, digested it, and produced it in small bits back to us, suggesting to us that if we want to reduce our own presentation of the history of the faith, this is a good place to start, a very sound place to start. In fact, it's good for us from a study point of view to have the grid, again, the overall image of the shape of the first Baha'i century and its events. And then that continued, of course, in the next part of the process by looking at the 4 periods of the first Baha'i century as outlined by Shoghi Effendi in the foreword to God Passes By. We'll be moving forward to that. Meanwhile, we've reviewed the question of the details related to the Bab and to Baha'u'llah, and now we've come to the section on the Master, Abdu'l-Bahá, the servant of Baha. And I'm going to put that up on the screen here for you. All right, now this is what you're seeing, I think. All right, it's good for us to know Abdu'l-Bahā's given name, Abbas Effendi. He was never called Abdu'l-Bahá during the lifetime of Baha'u'llah. He was always referred to as the master by Baha'u'llah, and there's one incident where he says something about the master, and he says, who is the master? And Baha'u'llah says, there's only one master. And he indicates his son, Abbas Effendi. Now he's been appointed, it states here quite clearly, one as his lawful successor, and then again as the authorized interpreter of his teachings. These are inherent in the tablets of Baha'u'llah and that are then identified with Abdu'l-Bahá subsequently, and in the Book of the Covenant of Baha'u'llah. Now, to place the figure of Abdu'l-Bahá into the succession of history, we have Shoghi Effendi stating that the master, since early childhood, had been closely associated with his father and shared his exile and tribulations, and remained a prisoner until 1908, when, as a result of the Young Turk Revolution, he was released from his confinement. These are 3 very important points that you would want to add about the background on Abdu'l-Bahá until his release as a result of the Young Turk Revolution. Having been freed from this confinement, he established his residence in Haifa. And he embarked soon after that, because that was 1910, soon after that on his 3-year journey to Egypt, Europe, and North America. And in that 3-year period, he expounded before vast audiences, what did he expound? The teachings of his father, and predicted the approach of that catastrophe that was soon to befall mankind. Very interesting to then look back at the talks of Abdu'l-Bahá and see what were the occasions and what did he emphasize. And people say, okay, he gave the 12 principles, but if you go back, and it's pretty hard to find the 12 principles. You find 12 principles, you find 11 principles, you find 15 principles. It's not limited that way. This was the principles that he chose out of all the essential principles and teachings of his father to stress and expound in audiences which it was estimated in the year of the centenary of his travels to have approached something like 90,000 individuals who actually saw Abdu'l-Bahá and heard his talks. That is, friends, in itself, I would comment, a terrific indictment against the American people, that they heard him, they witnessed the master, they witnessed this extraordinary human being which reflects to a degree that no other human being has ever reflected the qualifications and attributes of a manifestation of God. Extraordinary. What did they do after they heard him? Go out and have chocolate ice cream. I don't know what happened, but this gradually became the source of disappointment to Abdu'l-Bahá. He limited the scope of his writings. You can perceive that through reading the texts of the talks. Not all the talks, but most of the talks. And then he began warning them about, in the course of all of this, about what was going to happen. A war was coming and a catastrophe that they couldn't even dream of. There'd been nothing like that in the history of mankind when it came. All right, we've had the terrible World War, the Second World War since then, but at that time, this was the most that anybody could imagine, and couldn't even imagine that. Then Shoghi Effendi goes on. We have had his early childhood with Baha'u'llah, then we've had his residence in Haifa and his 3-year journey to Egypt, Europe, and North America. It's interesting to note that Egypt then constitutes his visit to Africa, his months in Africa at the same time as being in Egypt. He returned to his home on the eve of the First World War, in the course of which he was exposed to constant danger until the liberation of Palestine by the forces under the command of General Allenby, who extended the utmost consideration to him and to the small band of his fellow exiles in Akka and Haifa. Remember, Shoghi Effendi is talking to this United Nations committee. Now, during the war, several times it looked like the invasion and capture of the Holy Land was going to take place. And you had the general on the side of the Turks saying that if they captured Haifa, they would crucify Abdu'l-Bahá upside down on the top of Mount Carmel. There, you can read the details of this, of course, in God Passes By Itself. Then finally, he arrives to the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. In 1921, he passed away, buried in a vault in the mausoleum erected on Mount Carmel at the express instruction of Baha'u'llah for the remains of the Bab, which had previously been transferred from Tabriz to the Holy Land after having been preserved and concealed for no less than 60 years. Now, friends, we're moving on after the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, which marked the termination of the first and heroic age of the Baha'i faith. Remember, we spoke in the previous classes about the heroic age and the formative age, and finally the golden age. This passing of Abdu'l-Bahá signalized the termination of the goal of the heroic age of the faith, but then it signalized the opening of the formative age of the faith. And it was destined to witness the gradual emergence of its administrative order. Now, this is the first mention of the administrative order to this committee and in our summary that we're looking at. Notice he goes right back to the origins of it, and he establishes certain truths that we want to take note of. They've been indented here for our purposes of this study copy of this document. This administrative order whose establishment had been foretold by the Bab, whose laws were revealed by Baha'u'llah, whose outlines were delineated by Abdu'l-Bahá in his will and testament, whose foundations are now being laid by the national and local councils, which are elected by the professed adherents of the faith, which are paving the way for the constitution of the World Council to be designated as the Universal House of Justice, which in conjunction with me as its appointed head and the authorized interpreter of the Baha'i teachings, then look what he says here. He says, must coordinate and direct the affairs of the Baha'i community, whose seat will be permanently established in the Holy Land in close proximity to its world spiritual center, the resting places of its founders. Shoghi Effendi used to say that the administrative order is standing in the shadow of the world spiritual center of its shrines. The establishment foretold by the Bab, there's more details about that. We perhaps can come back to it another time, but there's a reference that Shoghi Effendi highlights from the Persian Bayan, in which he says, well is it with him who cometh to the order of Baha'u'llah, and then specifically mentioning both Baha'u'llah's name and the term which is translated order in English. So you have this marvelous order foreseen by the Bab, the laws of which were revealed by Baha'u'llah in the Kitabi Akdas and tablets supplemental to the Kitabi Akdas, and whose outlines were delineated by Abdu'l-Bahá in his will and testament. I think the friends may not realize that Baha'u'llah announced the House of Justice in the Kitabi Akdas. He did not promulgate the Kitabi Akdas immediately. He mentioned certain features of it that were carried by pilgrims and visitors back to the cradle of the faith, back to Iran, and suggested some of the things that were here. But he told these pilgrims specifically that the friends must not repeat the words House of Justice ever. At that time, it was very dangerous. So you can imagine that how it might have been interpreted that this House of Justice was going to have some power to rule over anybody. And then it was only later that the details became clear. But even then, the details were not fully set forth. And that's why we see here the phrase of the guardian whose outlines, the outlines of the administrative order, were delineated by Abdu'l-Bahá in his will and testament. Friends, there's nowhere in the Kitabi Akdas that tells us how the House of Justice will come into being or where it's going to come from. It's only in the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá that we find the references to its election, its universal election, through the secondary houses of justice, or as we call them now, national spiritual assemblies. So there are a number of things in the will and testament that supplement the word of God, that supplement the foundations of the House of Justice in the Kitabi Akdas. This is quite an important point to remember and to study and outline when we're reading the will and testament. Then he talks about the foundations of this, because we have references to both the Universal House of Justice and to local houses of justice in the Kitab Yaqtas. Abdu'l-Bahá supplements that by setting forth what he refers to as secondary houses of justice, which are now the national spiritual assemblies themselves around the world. These have all been elected by professed adherents of the faith. And Shoghi Effendi points out to the committee back in 1947, paving the way for the constitution of the World Council to be designated as the Universal House of Justice. Quite clear here, not International House of Justice. He refers to it as International House of Justice in some of his writings, but the preferred title and the one that finally adopted by the House of Justice itself is Universal House of Justice, or as Shoghi Effendi calls it in one document, God's Universal House of Justice. This house, in conjunction with Shoghi Effendi, and it's very, very seldom that you see Shoghi Effendi referring to himself at all, but here he has to make clear what's going on. He says, in conjunction with me as its appointed head and the authorized interpreter of the Baha'i teachings, and then the coordination and direction of the affairs of the Baha'i community. He, when he refers up a few points to the foundations now being laid by the national and local councils, these foundations were all being outlined by Shoghi Effendi, and he was calling successively in his messages, as you are aware, in the collected messages of Shoghi Effendi, the Baha'i administration and the messages to America that followed. These foundations he was directing and encouraging. He has not emphasized that point. Most of the time he refers to the three central figures and what they do, and then the administrative order came and what it did and its two pillars and so on. But he doesn't emphasize much his own position. Very selfless. Now, after having moved through these points in relation to the opening of the formative age of the faith, we come to Shoghi Effendi's summary of the administrative order itself. He says it's destined to evolve into the Baha'i World Commonwealth. Friends, later on you would see in messages, if you study the whole range of Shoghi Effendi's messages, that the Baha'i World Commonwealth is a stage which we are destined eventually to come to as the world order of Baha'u'llah, the successor of the administrative order. The administrative order is the embryonic world order of Baha'u'llah that's to come into being. And that will then evolve into the Baha'i World Commonwealth. The Baha'i World Commonwealth is the international association of Baha'i states throughout the world, the different ones that are there, at a stage when there's enough of them that they will constitute in the world a majority of the world's states or nations. And that's a stage which is described in broadest terms by Shoghi Effendi in his writings. The administrative order of the faith, he says, has already survived the assaults launched against its institutions by such formidable foes as the kings of the Qajar dynasty, the caliphs of Islam, the ecclesiastical leaders of Egypt, and the Nazi regime in Germany. It's already extended its ramifications to every continent of the globe, stretching from Iceland to the extremity of Chile. It's been established, and these figures, of course, are long outdated, but it gives you the scope of where it was in 1947. has been established in no less, this administrative order, than 88 countries of the world, has gathered in its pale representatives of no less than 31 races, numbers among its supporters Christians of various denominations, Muslims of both Sunni and Shia sects, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Zoroastrians, and Buddhists. A broad representation, though in miniature still, of the constitution of the Baha'i world in the future. Then he adds, he's outlining, obviously, for this committee, different developments, but it's important for us to know when we want to talk about how the faith has developed. You can see in the latest volumes of the Baha'i World Book, updated figures on the number of translated languages into which the Baha'i literature has been translated, which are over 800 now. It's established and disseminated through its appointed agencies. Baha'i literature in 48 languages has already consolidated its structure through the incorporation of 5 national assemblies. Those, of course, the numbers those are much higher now. 77 local assemblies, as lands as far apart as South America, India, and the Antipodes. Incorporations that legally empower its elected representatives to hold property as trustees of the Baha'i community. Realize the Baha'i community was formed, there were local spiritual assemblies. They needed to have some legal foundation. And Shoghi Effendi called upon the American National Assembly to investigate the possibilities of establishing the incorporation papers, the legal constitution, and applying to the government that the body of the local assembly would be the representative of the community and would legally hold on behalf of the community property deeds. It would hold the funds of the contributed funds of the faith as a nonprofit organization, obviously. And this began spreading in both amongst local assemblies and also, as he says here, 5 national assemblies, but eventually dozens of other national assemblies. This administrative order disposes of international, national, and local endowments estimated at several million pounds and spread over every continent of the globe. This is in 47 now. You can imagine where we are now. It enjoys in several countries the privilege of official recognition by civil authorities. And that official recognition enables it to secure exemption from taxation for its endowments, its properties, and the right to solemnize or perform, if you will, Baha'i marriages. And numbers among its stately edifices that are owned by this national assemblies. 2 temples, the one erected in Russian Turkestan, which has since been destroyed by an earthquake, and the other on the shore of Lake Michigan in Wilmette on the outskirts of Chicago. This kind of gives you an overall picture then of what the early administrative order of the faith looked like. Shoghi Effendi goes on to explain other very basic points that we want to absorb and be able to repeat when we're talking about the administrative order. The administrative order, this administrative order, unlike the systems evolved after the death of the founders of the various religions, is divine in origin. We can point to texts, Baha'u'llah in the Aqdas, Abdu'l-Bahá in the Will and Testament, and other supplementary tablets. Many different aspects of the administrative order. It was well foreseen that it was coming, although we didn't know the form of it until the will was revealed after the passing of the master. It's provided the foundation for the future growth of the faith right up to the Golden Age and on and beyond that. Shoghi Effendi to pilgrims is to have said that the administrative order, that the cause is like a tree, a young tree. It's been watered with the blood of 20,000 martyrs. And this tree is flourishing and putting out branches and leaves and growing, steadily growing. It rests securely on laws, precepts, ordinances, and institutions, which the founder of the faith has himself specifically laid down and unequivocally established. Shoghi Effendi then indicated that when this young tree blossoms, when it flowers, that will be the transformation of the present-day administrative order, which is embryonic, and it becomes then the world order of Baha'u'llah. You want to read and study enough so you can distinguish between the administrative order of the faith and its capacity to direct the activities of the Baha'i faith in the world, and the world order of Baha'u'llah, where in those places where it becomes the majority, it will take on other civil duties and capacities. The whole thing functions in strict accordance with the interpretations of the authorized interpreters of its holy scriptures, in which case that would be the master on the one hand and Shoghi Effendi, the single guardian of the cause that we've had since then. Though this administrative order has been fiercely assailed ever since its inception, it has, by virtue of its character, unique in the annals of the world's religious history, succeeded in maintaining the unity of the diversified and far-flung body of its supporters, and enabled them to launch unitedly and systematically enterprises in both hemispheres designed to extend its limits and consolidate its administrative institutions. You can see, friends, from this, in order to have this unity of such a diversified, far-flung body of supporters as the faith has, how important the principles of Baha'u'llah to obedience, to establish civil authority and government, and freedom from involvement in partisan political activities. We had communities in so many different countries all over the world. Some of those, if we were supporting political parties in our own country, they would be in contrast and opposed to the political views of the parties in power in other countries. And for that reason, Shoghi Effendi goes on to explain more about this order. And the order, he said, this administrative order, which has been created by God, and it's the first time we have a divinely established administration of any religion. We had some successorships, but they were not strong enough to hold the unity of the community together. This order serves, the faith serves, is served by this order. It's safeguarded by the administrative order, and the administrative order promotes it. And then he adds, very interestingly enough, in this connection, the essential character of the order, which is supernatural. I mean, it's divine in origin. It's more than a natural development. It's fed by the streams of inspiration, the energies generated by the revelation of two successive manifestations of God. And then another quite interesting word, supranational. It goes beyond being nationalistic in character, but is the first international order non-political international order, entirely non-political and non-partisan, and diametrically opposed to any policy or school of thought that seeks to exalt any particular race, class, or nation. This is very important, friends, in terms of the false gods that have been mentioned also in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, the three false gods of racism, nationalism, and communism. Then he states that it's free from any form of ecclesiasticism. And I think we understand that because we know there's neither priesthood nor rituals in the Baha'i faith. Now, rituals is sometimes understood in more than one way. We have no man-made rituals. We have no church-invented rituals. The House of Justice is not there to establish rituals for us beyond what's established in the cause. We have what could be considered rituals in the form of the obligatory prayers that are given to us. And thank God for them because they orient us on a daily basis to renew our attitude and direction towards our Maker. Then, besides being free from this clergy and priesthood, it's supported, the faith, the administrative order is supported exclusively by voluntary contributions made by its avowed adherents. Now, in this, with the present day development of a community of friends, associates with us, helping in the goals of community development that the House of Justice has called for, we want to eventually make clear to the friends, and I think it comes up because those that are excited about helping with the cause and its development say, well, should we be contributing, or where does the money come for this? And then that has to be explained. And this is, of course, a privilege of avowed adherents of the faith. Interesting in this connection to remember the House of Justice, in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, the founder of the faith, Baha'u'llah, says the first thing is the recognition of the manifestation of God and submission to his laws. That's the first duty incumbent upon man. So as much as we spread our interests out into community development and these other things, it's important, but eventually we have to insinuate and bring the people to an understanding that there is a membership in the Baha'i cause, which has certain privileges and certainly certain blessings, and to make that clear to people. Though loyal to their respective governments, that is, we obey the governments, though imbued with love of their own country, we're not anti-patriotic and anxious to promote at all times its best interest. The followers of the Baha'i faith, nevertheless, viewing mankind as one entity and profoundly attached to its vital interests, will not hesitate to subordinate every particular interest, be it personal, regional, or national, to the overriding interests of the generality of mankind. Really, this is the stamp of explanation of our oneness of mankind, the organized oneness of mankind through the revelation of the faith. Was just noticing some of the notes coming in here. Let me go on with this. It's not too much more of it here. Knowing full well, the continuation of this same, what the followers of the Baha'i faith are stating about their administrative order. knowing full well that in a world of interdependent peoples and nations, the advantage of the part is best to be reached by the advantage of the whole, and that no lasting result can be achieved by any of the component parts if the general interests of the entity itself are neglected. Yeah, that's the end, friends, of the overview that was given on this subject. The overview, this, if you will, of the early history of the cause. Someone has said, could we address why Shoghi Effendi in America and the Most Great Peace state that Baha'is are accused of a number of things, amongst them communism? Thank you. I have to go back to America and the Most Great Peace and see what was stated there. If you have that at hand, you could type that in there. Certainly, as we believe that communism is a false god and all that derives from it, can hardly remain accused of this if the facts are known, and we have to bring them to light. Let's see what else we have here. Is the question about the prospects for rebuilding the temple in Ashgabat. Well, I know that there's a fund that exists that friends have contributed to for a number of decades to eventually rebuild the temple in Ashgabat. I don't know, I can't say what exactly at the present time. When I was on the House of Justice, it was looked at favorably that the time would come when we'd be able to rebuild this first house of worship in Asia. So what the prospects are right now, I don't know quite how to answer that. Let's see. Does this bring me back to, are you here? Am I here with you again? All right. There's a bit of a delay I see between the two screens.
That's fine. Do you want the document or you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's go to the next document, friends. This is a breakdown. This is, we're back to the previous document. I want to find the next document now. 10, history here. An overview or four periods of the first Baha'i century. This also again is one of these. If you look at these documents and you extract details from them, you'll have the basis for being able to present factual, truthful, soundly grounded facts about the Baha'i, the development of the Baha'i faith, and the position of its central figures with regard to its existence. I think you have this, and you have four periods of first Baha'i century on your screens now. Again, I had extracted earlier some of these characterizations of the central figures of the faith. I'd like to go through that again because no amount of repeating this is sufficient as far as I can understand. The first period of this first Baha'i century, here Shoghi Effendi is dividing the four periods of the first 100 years of the faith into the three ministries of the three central figures, and then the first 2 decades, roughly 2 decades of the development of its administrative order. It centers around the gentle, the youthful, and the irresistible person of the Bab, matchless in his meekness, imperturbable in his serenity, magnetic in his utterance, unrivaled in the dramatic episodes of his swift and tragic ministry. It begins with the declaration of his mission, culminates in his martyrdom, and ends in a veritable orgy of religious massacre, revolting in its hideousness. It's characterized by 9 years of fierce and relentless contest, whose theater was the whole of Persia, in which above 10,000 heroes laid down their lives, in which 2 sovereigns of the Qajar dynasty and their wicked ministers participated, and which was supported by the entire Shia ecclesiastical hierarchy, by the military resources of the state, and by the implacable hostility of the masses. The second period derives its inspiration from the august period of figure of Baha'u'llah, preeminent in holiness, awesome in the majesty of his strength and power, unapproachable in the transcendent brightness of his glory. It opens with the first stirrings in the soul of Baha'u'llah while in the Syed Chal of Tehran of the revelation anticipated by the Bab. Attains its plenitude in the proclamation of that revelation to kings and ecclesiastical leaders of the earth, and terminates in the ascension of its author in the vicinity of the prison town of Akka. These first stirrings of the soul of Baha'u'llah while in the Syed Chal of Tehran, this is very interesting. This is the first revelation in which we have the account of the manifestation of God, of his reception of the revelation that's been gifted to him by God, of which he then is the bearer and revealer to mankind. This period of Baha'u'llah extends over 39 years of continuous and unprecedented, overpowering revelation. Unprecedented and overpowering revelation as compared with the past. It's marked by the propagation of the faith to the neighboring territories of Turkey, of Russia, of Iraq, of Syria, of Egypt, and of India, and is distinguished by a corresponding aggravation of hostility represented by the united attacks launched by the Shah of Persia and the Sultan of Turkey, the 2 admittedly most powerful potentates of the East, as well as the opposition of the twin sacerdotal orders of Shia and Sunni Islam. Again, we have this, the Guardian's take on the third period, that is the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá. The third period revolves around the vibrant personality of Abdu'l-Bahá, mysterious in his essence, unique in his station, astoundingly potent in both the charm and strength of his character. It commences with the announcement of the covenant of Baha'u'llah, a document without parallel in the history of any earlier dispensation, attains its climax in the emphatic assertion by the sender of that covenant in the city of the covenant, that would be New York City, of the unique character and far-reaching implications of that document, of the covenant of Baha'u'llah. And it closes with his passing and his interment on Mount Carmel. It will go down in history as a period of almost 30 years duration in which tragedies and triumphs have been so intertwined as to eclipse at one time the orb of the covenant, and at another time to pour forth its light over the continent of Europe and as far as Australasia, the Far East, and the North American continent. Some very interesting developments, friends. Shoghi Effendi likens these different periods. These first three, particularly these first three, and then finally the fourth period. He characterizes them in the following way. He says that during the period of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the light of God was infused through divine revelation into the world. Then in the time of Abdu'l-Bahá and subsequently with the birth of the administrative order of the faith, the centenary of which we're coming to next year, he uses the word diffuses. The light of God has been infused through the manifestations into the system of mankind, into the life of the world. And now the center of the covenant has organized a plan for the diffusion of that light to further propagate it beyond the countries that it reached during the lifetime of the manifestations. He's now included, 130 territories all over the world to which the faith had to reach. And then Shoghi Effendi gradually mustering the Baha'i world to prepare itself to study and prepare itself so that it could send out teachers to follow on the early heroes of the divine plan to help establish the faith throughout these remaining territories of the world. Then Shoghi Effendi talks about after we've had the infusion of the divine forces through the manifestations of God, and then the diffusion through the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá and the early stages of the development up to now of the administrative order of the cause. He talks about the eventual suffusion of the light of God. So the diffusion, the light of God is spread over the face of the whole globe. It touches the geography, of all these other places throughout the world. But now is a time when it must begin to penetrate, suffuse those nations over which it has which has diffused its light. And now through these administrative institutions that are established as part of the development of the diffusion of the light, those first agencies, they begin to develop and foreshadow the suffusion of the light of the revelation itself into the life of mankind, into the activities of those countries, their different geographical locations, and finally down to the very neighborhoods themselves in which we're involved with activities of the plan. Beyond that, let me take a look at the notes here for Sidi. Beyond that, now we come to the fourth period. Again, it's as described in the foreword of God Passes By, written in 1944. It's motivated by the forces radiating from the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, that charter of Baha'u'llah's New World Order. This is interesting to note that the will is the charter of the world order of Baha'u'llah. And it's the offspring, this will and testament is the offspring resulting from the mystic intercourse between him who is the source of the law of God, Baha'u'llah himself, and the mind of the one who is the vehicle and interpreter of that law, which is Abdu'l-Bahá. There's a unique connection here between a manifestation of God and someone who's not a manifestation of God and yet reflects all the qualities and attributes of a manifestation of God. Why Abdu'l-Bahá is the mystery of God. The inception of this last period of the first Baha'i century synchronizes with the birth of the formative age of the Baha'i era and with the founding of the administrative order of the faith of Baha'u'llah, a system which is at once the harbinger, the nucleus, and pattern of his world order. So you've got now the administrative order to be succeeded by the world order of Baha'u'llah. This period, described by the Guardian in God Passes By, covering the first 23 years of this formative age, has already been distinguished by an outburst of further hostility of a different character, accelerating on the one hand the diffusion of the faith over a still wider area in each of the 5 continents of the globe, and resulting on the other in the emancipation and recognition of the independent status of several communities within its pale. So now you have the source of these, friends. I hope you'll go back and review these and indeed the earlier documents which we've been citing parts of from the beginning of these classes to really make them your own. Ask yourselves questions about them and see how you can incorporate them in your own presentations to other friends. I hope you've taken note of this question of infusion, diffusion, and suffusion of the light of God as represented by the initial work of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, and then diffusion through Abdu'l-Bahá, and the beginning decades of the administrative order, the development of the administrative order of the faith. And then finally now by the dawning of this period of suffusion of the faith, wherever the core activities are firmly established and the cause is beginning to spread in a very solid manner. Let's see if there's any other questions here. I'm glad to see you all understood everything, so you haven't asked any questions. That's very good. How do I get myself back here again? There. Where am I now? Huh? Press this.
You're good. You're good.
There. Can you see me again, friends? Sorry. I keep appearing and disappearing and appearing to myself as well. So what is it we're trying to do here? I mean, I'm hoping to help animate the friends to look back at these core documents of the cause, the guidance of Shoghi Effendi, his overview of Baha'i history, which he talks about us mastering the essentials of Baha'i history and its verities. And then we have this picture that we have here of the history of the faith in a nutshell presentation by the Guardian, and the characterization of the central figures, which is something that we don't want to lose sight of. It's wonderful assistance to us to be able to describe the central figures of the faith. Then we have the vision of the future, which we'll take up in a subsequent class, where Shoghi Effendi outlines various stages in his writings. As I made them out, there are 10 of them, successive stages. Some of them are suffused one with the other. Not all of them take place in all of the countries at the same time, but we're moving forward with this pattern. And we'll want to identify those and look back at the passages in the writings which mention them. So I think that's it for this week, friends, and we wish you a very enjoyable weekend coming up. And we'll be back with you next Thursday with some, I hope, inspiring insights. Thank you.